Some folks never notice the quiet ones, the ones who move through life like a shadow on a dusty road, and yet they leave marks no one can erase. Lily Harper stood at the edge of the town square, her hands tucked tightly into the sleeves of a faded gray shawl, dust clinging to the hem of her worn dress. The wooden boards of the sidewalk creaked beneath her boots as she paused, scanning the small crowd that had gathered for the Saturday market. Faces turned away, whispers floated like dry leaves in the wind, and a child dropped a basket of apples without so much as a glance back. Lily pressed her lips together, forcing a calm she did not feel, and adjusted the small satchel that carried the remnants of her lunch and a folded letter from home. The sun was climbing toward midday, the heat baking the street and lifting a thin haze of dust from the dirt roads, and the air smelled of pine tar, livestock, and sun-baked clay. She felt the eyes of the town resting on her back in 1,000 small ways, some curious, some pitying, most dismissive, and yet she held herself straight, shoulders squared, chin lifted just enough to keep from folding inward. A cart rattled past, scattering loose straw, and a dog barked somewhere behind a fence, breaking the quiet like a single note in a song. Lily stepped forward, careful not to disturb the rhythm of life around her, each motion deliberate, measured, small, and yet in that smallness there was a strength that no one watching could fully understand. Her boots scuffed the boards as she moved past the merchant's stalls, past the baker who offered her a nod she barely caught, past the blacksmith whose hammer sang on the anvil with a steady beat that reminded her of her father's workshop. Every sound seemed amplified in the heat and stillness, the scrape of cart wheels, the creak of signs swinging in the light breeze, the soft shuffle of feet on the dirt, all painting a picture of a town that saw her but didn't truly notice. Lily's eyes, a pale gray that reflected the harsh sunlight, darted to a shadow at the edge of the square, a tall figure leaning against the post of the general store, hat brim low, hands tucked into leather gloves, watching the crowd as if it were a story unfolding page by page. Ethan Caldwell, known in whispers as a man no one dared to challenge, stood in quiet observation, his expression unreadable, but his eyes sharp, scanning, patient. He saw her not for the tattered dress or the dust, not for the hesitation in her steps, but for the small, precise way she adjusted a basket left behind by a careless customer, the way she smoothed a crease in a discarded cloth, the way her fingers moved over objects with a care and attention that spoke of competence, patience, and hidden skill. The contrast was stark. To everyone else, she was fragile, meek, the one to pity, and yet in that measured, careful attention, in the silence she carried like a cloak around her, there was a quiet assertion that she existed not as the world had defined her, but as someone who could hold her own in ways unseen. Lily stopped for a moment under the shade of a weathered signpost, hands brushing the straps of her satchel, feeling the heat from the sun on the boards beneath her boots and the dust in the air rising like tiny sparks. The town seemed to breathe around her, unaware, yet every glance, every murmur, every shift in stance, quietly acknowledged her presence without truly understanding it. She inhaled the dry air, tasted the faint hint of wood smoke and apples, and allowed herself a slow, deliberate exhale. Here, in the middle of the square where she had been deemed weak, pitted, overlooked, the first thread of something else began to stir, a sense that her strength, though invisible to all but one observer, had not gone unnoticed entirely, and that the quiet weight she carried in her hands, in her posture, in the way she moved through the light and dust, might yet change the way the world regarded her. The morning sun was climbing higher in the sky, casting long shadows across the town square, and Lily Harper adjusted the straps of her satchel as she moved past the merchant stalls, her steps measured and deliberate. The wooden boards under her boots groaned softly, each creak mingling with the faint chatter of townspeople who were beginning to set up for the day. She paused by a well, the iron handle cool under her fingers, and tilted her head slightly as she observed the rhythm of life around her, noting the small, unremarkable details that everyone else overlooked, the way the horse tied to a post stamped its hooves, the way the bread vendor arranged the loaves, the way a breeze lifted dust in tiny spirals that caught the sunlight. Her gray eyes swept the scene, landing for a moment on Ethan Caldwell leaning against the post outside the general store, hat brim low, arms crossed, watching without interfering, the sunlight catching the angles of his face, emphasizing the lines carved by years of work and quiet observation. Lily moved toward the center of the square, careful not to draw attention, yet her presence was quietly marked by those who chose to glance, a subtle ripple through the crowd that did not disturb her, but she registered nonetheless. A child ran past, scattering straw from a tipped-over basket, and Lily bent slightly to gather what she could, straightening the items with careful hands, her movements precise and efficient, drawing Ethan's gaze for the briefest of moments before he returned to his silent watch. The air smelled of pine tar, fresh hay, and the faint tang of river water, and she breathed it in, letting the heat and dust settle over her like a familiar cloak. She approached a crate stacked near the edge of the square and adjusted a small bundle of herbs she carried from her home, the leaves brushing against her palms as she smoothed them into place, noting the neat alignment of each sprig. The townspeople around her paid little mind, their focus elsewhere, their whispers a soft undertone to the day. Yet Ethan observed every small motion, every careful placement, the way her fingers brushed dirt from her hands before touching the bundle, the slight tilt of her head as she considered the weight of the letters she carried. A wind stirred, lifting the edges of her shawl, and she drew it closer, the fabric worn but sturdy, shielding her arms from the sun as she bent to retrieve a dropped coin from the ground, her movements quiet, almost reverent in their deliberation. Ethan shifted slightly, resting his weight on one leg, the subtle motion unnoticed by the crowd, his eyes tracing her form as she straightened, adjusting the folds of her dress, her back to him, yet moving with a grace that spoke of patience and resilience. The market continued around them, the sounds of haggling, the clip-clop of hooves, the creak of carts, but in that space between the noise and the sunlit dust, a silent understanding passed, though neither had spoken a word. Lily paused at the edge of the square, surveying the path ahead, the street lined with wooden posts and swinging signs, and allowed herself a slow exhale, feeling the warmth of the day settle on her shoulders. Every detail mattered, every small act of care she took in arranging her satchel, smoothing her shawl, adjusting her steps, was a testament to a quiet strength no one yet fully recognized, and in that stillness, Ethan Caldwell acknowledged it, a shadow of a smile brushing the corner of his mouth as he tipped his hat ever so slightly and returned to his watch, the two of them occupying the same space, separate yet bound by a subtle, unspoken awareness. The streets of the town square were warming under the midday sun, the light spilling across wooden boards and creating a pattern of shadows that shifted with the slow sway of the buildings. Lily Harper paused near the edge of a wagon stand, her fingers brushing against the rough-hewn wood as she adjusted the small satchel at her side, checking the alignment of her few belongings with meticulous care. Dust rose in thin spirals around her boots as a slight breeze carried the scent of fresh hay and baked bread from the market stalls, blending with the faint tang of iron from the blacksmith's forge down the lane. She moved slowly, each step measured, careful not to disturb a fallen crate or the loose straw that had scattered across the boards. In the distance, Ethan Caldwell leaned against the post of the general store, his hat pulled low to shade his eyes, observing the flow of the day with quiet patience. He noticed the subtle way Lily adjusted the folds of her shawl, the gentle motion of her hands as they smoothed the surface of a dropped cloth, the tilt of her head as she considered the sun and shadows around her. Each small act, unnoticed by the bustling crowd, marked her as someone who moved with purpose even in silence. A horse tied nearby shifted its weight, ears flicking, and Lily paused to glance at it, offering a soft pat on the muzzle, her fingers grazing the warm hair, and for a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Ethan's gaze lingered, noting the care in her touch, the way she balanced attention to detail with awareness of her surroundings, her quiet strength evident in her posture and movements. She straightened, brushing dust from her hands, and glanced at the far edge of the square where a child had left a small basket overturned, picking up the scattered contents and arranging them neatly with a careful hand. The sun climbed higher, warming her shoulders through the faded fabric of her dress, and she felt the heat and dust settle around her like a cloak, grounding her presence in the world even as she remained largely unseen. A soft sound of hooves approached, and Lily lifted her eyes, noting a small procession of wagons moving slowly down the lane, the boards beneath the wheels vibrating with each pass, sending small echoes across the square. She stepped aside with grace, allowing the wagon to pass, and adjusted her satchel once more, fingers lingering over the leather strap, noting the slight fray from use, the worn edges that told of distance traveled and careful handling. Ethan shifted slightly, his eyes following her movements, noting the alignment of her actions with the rhythm of the town, the way she interacted with objects and people around her, not with haste or need, but with attention and quiet diligence. The air carried a mix of scents, pine sap, warm bread, and the faint dust of the road, and Lily inhaled deeply, letting it fill her senses as she considered the path ahead, the layout of the square, and the position of those who might notice her if they chose. She paused once more at the edge, scanning the crowd and the stalls with measured eyes, and in that moment, a sense of calm awareness settled over her, a quiet assertion of presence and competence that had gone unnoticed by most, yet marked her in a subtle way that only Ethan Caldwell had begun to recognize, the silent acknowledgment of skill and purpose passing between them without a single word spoken, a bond of awareness forming in the stillness of the warm, dusty square. The market was settling into its midday rhythm, the clatter of coins and the hum of conversation weaving through the warm, dry air, and Lily Harper moved with quiet precision, her eyes catching the subtle movements of the people around her as she adjusted a bundle of letters tied with twine in her satchel. The sun had risen higher, spilling golden light across the worn wooden boards of the sidewalk, highlighting the faint scratches and splinters that told the story of countless boots and wagon wheels passing this way over the years. She paused near a stack of firewood, brushing a layer of dust from the top log with the back of her hand, the motion small and unassuming, yet deliberate, a testament to the care she took in everything she touched. Ethan Caldwell shifted his weight against the post of the general store, hat brim low, eyes following her with quiet attention, noticing the way her fingers lingered on the objects she handled, the subtle ease with which she balanced the weight of her satchel against her shoulder, and the way her eyes scanned the square, noting the position of each person, each cart, each stray animal with an almost imperceptible calculation. A breeze stirred the loose strands of her hair, brushing across her forehead and catching in the folds of her shawl, and she tucked it back carefully, mindful of the sun and the dust, aware of the heat settling onto her shoulders through the worn fabric. A child ran past, carrying a small basket of goods, and Lily bent slightly to steady it, smoothing the contents with delicate, precise motions and straightening the items with a care that went unnoticed by the bustling town around her. Ethan's gaze lingered, tracing the arc of her movements, noting the small, intentional acts that spoke of patience, awareness, and quiet strength. She moved past the blacksmith, whose hammer rang steadily on the anvil, the metallic notes mingling with the scent of pine tar and fresh bread from the baker's stall, and she allowed herself a brief glance at the patterns in the dust and sunlight, noting the play of shadows across the boards, the way the light caught the edges of the wagon wheels, the movement of the horse tied to the post with gentle stomps that disturbed little puffs of dust. Lily paused by a fallen sign leaning against the store, adjusting its position, and straightened, brushing her hands over her dress, smoothing the folds, and checking the alignment of the bundle she carried. Ethan shifted slightly, noting the way she occupied the space, not boldly, not seeking attention, but moving with a quiet authority that contrasted with the pitying glances of the townspeople. The air carried the warmth of the sun, the faint aroma of baked bread, pine sap, and the dust of the road, and Lily breathed it in, feeling the rhythm of the town in the hum of voices, the clatter of coins, the shuffle of feet, and the occasional scrape of a card on the boards. She took a deliberate step forward, adjusting her satchel once more, and allowed herself a slow exhale, letting the quiet strength she carried settle within her, a presence that was understated yet undeniable, a subtle thread of awareness passing between her and Ethan, connecting them in the shared space of the sunlit, dusty square, a silent understanding forming without a single word exchanged, each observing the other through the lens of attention, patience, and quiet recognition. The sun had climbed higher, warming the boards beneath Lily Harper's boots as she moved with careful steps through the square, her hands brushing a thin layer of dust from the bundle she carried. Each stall, each crate, each wagon will seem to tell a story, and she took in the details with quiet attentiveness, noting the curve of a basket handle, the alignment of freshly baked bread loaves, the way the light shifted across the windows of the general store. Ethan Caldwell remained at the edge of the square, his eyes observing, noting the subtle grace in her movements, the precision in the way she handled each small task. A breeze lifted the strands of her hair across her forehead, and she tucked them back with a delicate hand, smoothing the worn fabric of her shawl against her shoulders, the movement almost imperceptible to anyone else but clear to him. She paused at the edge of a small fountain, water spilling over the worn stone and glittering in the sunlight, and adjusted her satchel, straightening the letters inside and letting her fingers linger on the neat folds, a small ritual that spoke of patience and care. Around her, the townspeople moved with casual disregard, some haggling over goods, some attending to livestock, none noticing the quiet concentration in her gestures, the way she seemed to organize and attend to the world with gentle precision. Ethan's attention lingered on the subtle details, the way her fingers traced the edge of the satchel strap, the way she bent slightly to adjust a fallen crate, the slight tilt of her head as she considered the shadows falling across the boardwalk. A child ran past, scattering straw from a tipped basket, and Lily moved with quiet efficiency to right the contents, smoothing the items with hands that were small but steady, deliberate in motion and precise in placement. The sun rose fully overhead, casting warm light that glinted across the wooden boards and the metal handles of the market carts, creating patterns of gold and shadow that shifted as the wind stirred the dust. Lily paused, surveying the activity, noting the positions of carts and animals, of vendors and customers, all while maintaining her composure, a quiet command of space and attention that marked her presence without demand. Ethan adjusted slightly, his hat shadowing his eyes as he studied her, the faintest lift of his brow acknowledging the subtle authority in her actions, the careful attention to each small detail that spoke of skill and thoughtfulness, a competence invisible to the casual observer but unmistakable to one who cared to watch. The smell of warm bread, sun-baked wood, and faint pine filled the air, and Lily inhaled slowly, feeling grounded in the rhythm of the square, each step and gesture reinforcing the quiet strength she carried. She straightened once more, checking her satchel and smoothing the folds of her dress, aware of the sun on her shoulders and the dust in the air, her presence calm and assured, each careful movement a small testament to resilience and understated capability, noticed only by the one who had begun to see, connecting them silently in the bright, sunlit square. The afternoon sun shifted, casting long golden stripes across the dusty boards of the town square, and Lily Harper moved with quiet confidence, her steps measured and deliberate, the gentle rustle of her dress blending with the distant hum of conversation. She paused by the edge of a wooden crate, smoothing the bundle of herbs she carried and adjusting the satchel at her side with careful hands, each motion precise and thoughtful, revealing a patience that went unnoticed by those hurrying past her. The scent of pine tar, fresh bread, and warm earth mingled in the air, and she inhaled deeply, allowing herself a moment to feel grounded, to mark the rhythm of the town around her. A stray dog trotted past, brushing against her ankle, and she bent slightly to adjust a tin cup it had nudged off the boards, setting it back carefully in place, her fingers lingering on the cool metal before she straightened. Ethan Caldwell remained near the general store, hat brim shadowing his eyes, observing the way she moved through the square, noting the subtle care in every adjustment, the gentle focus that suggested awareness far beyond what anyone else might see. He shifted his weight, leaning slightly, his boots scuffing the boards softly as he studied the delicate balance in her motions, the way she considered each detail with quiet deliberation, aware of her surroundings yet absorbed in the minutiae of her own tasks. Lily moved toward the fountain at the center of the square, water glinting in the sunlight as it spilled over the worn stone edges, and she paused to arrange a small pile of letters she had placed on the edge, smoothing them with deliberate precision, aligning each envelope, so the folds were neat and uniform, a small act of order in the midst of the gentle chaos of the market. She glanced toward the distant carts and wagons, noting the shift of shadows and the movement of townspeople, adjusting her own path to avoid disrupting the rhythm of the day, moving with quiet authority despite her unassuming appearance. Ethan's eyes followed, noting the subtle strength in her posture, the way she handled the weight of her satchel and the precise placement of her hands, the small motions that conveyed competence, patience, and thoughtfulness without a single word spoken. A cart rumbled past, its wheels catching small pebbles and raising puffs of dust, and Lily stepped aside gracefully, adjusting her satchel and smoothing the folds of her dress, aware of the sunlight catching on the worn fabric and the dust settling on her boots and hands, grounding her presence in the space around her. She paused once more at the fountain, the cool water glinting in the late afternoon light, and allowed her gaze to sweep across the square, noting each detail with care, the alignment of crates, the placement of baskets, the way the shadows played across the boards. Ethan remained still, appreciating the quiet command of her movements, the way she engaged with the environment around her, attentive to every detail. Yet unobtrusive, a presence defined by thoughtfulness and quiet strength, creating a subtle connection between them that passed unnoticed by everyone else, an unspoken recognition of skill, care, and awareness in the sunlit, dusty square. The heat of the afternoon softened into a gentle warmth as Lily Harper moved toward the edge of the square, where the shade from the buildings offered a slight reprieve. She adjusted the satchel on her shoulder, the worn leather creaking softly, and allowed her gaze to wander over the bustling activity, noting the way a merchant arranged bundles of herbs, the slight tilt of a sign swinging in the breeze, and the way the sunlight reflected off the small metal handles of carts lined up along the street. A few townspeople paused in passing, glancing toward her with mild curiosity, but Lily's attention remained focused on the precise alignment of the letters and small parcels she carried, her hands smoothing and arranging them with quiet deliberation. Ethan Caldwell's eyes followed her movements from across the square, noting the subtle control she exerted over her surroundings, the way she navigated the crowd without disturbing a single object, the careful attention to her own posture and gestures that spoke of a quiet competence. A horse shifted its weight nearby, stamping softly on the wooden boards, and Lily bent slightly to straighten a small tin cup that had been nudged askew, the metal cool and smooth under her fingers as she replaced it exactly where it belonged. The sun dipped slightly toward the western edge of the square, casting elongated shadows across the dust-strewn boards, and the air was filled with the mingling scents of warm bread, pine tar, and the faint tang of livestock. Lily stepped around a low crate, pausing to adjust a folded cloth, smoothing it over the uneven surface with deliberate motions, and straightening her dress in a way that minimized the dust clinging to the fabric, each gesture subtle yet precise. Ethan shifted his stance, leaning slightly against the post, and watched the way her movements communicated thoughtfulness and care, her quiet actions reflecting an unspoken strength that contrasted sharply with the casual dismissiveness of the crowd. A breeze stirred the edges of her shawl, lifting it briefly from her shoulders, and she tucked it back carefully, aware of the sun on her neck and the faint heat rising from the wooden boards underfoot. She glanced briefly at a child who had left a small basket overturned and moved with smooth efficiency to right it, arranging the contents with a careful hand, and then continued her measured path through the square. Each sound, the scrape of cart wheels, the soft clop of a horse, the distant murmur of conversation, was a note in the rhythm she navigated, and she moved with awareness, integrating each sensory detail into her movements with deliberate care. Ethan's eyes lingered on the subtle coordination of her hands and posture, the way she handled weight, space, and timing with quiet assurance, noticing how she maintained control over her environment without demanding attention or recognition. The warmth of the sun, the scent of the town, the soft vibrations of the boards beneath her boots, all created a symphony of observation and response that she navigated with care, her presence steady and assured, a quiet thread of competence and resilience that marked her as someone who, though underestimated by many, possessed a careful strength that only those paying close attention could begin to perceive. In that sunlit, dusty space, the silent acknowledgment between her and Ethan persisted, a connection built from attention, observation, and the small yet deliberate acts of care that she wove through every motion of her day. The late afternoon sun cast a warm glow across the town square, illuminating the worn wooden boards and scattering patterns of light across the dust that rose with every step. Lily Harper moved with deliberate care, adjusting the straps of her satchel and smoothing the folds of her dress as she approached a fallen crate near the edge of the market. Her fingers lingered over the rough wood, brushing off a thin layer of dust before setting the bundle of letters she carried back into precise alignment, the edges straight and neat. The air carried the mingling scents of pine sap, fresh bread, and sun-baked earth, and she inhaled slowly, grounding herself in the rhythm of the afternoon. Ethan Caldwell remained near the post of the general store, observing with quiet patience, his hat brim casting a shadow over his sharp eyes as he noted the subtle motions of her hands, the careful way she adjusted the weight of her satchel, and the measured pace of her steps. A small child passed by, nudging a tin cup that had been set at the edge of a table, and Lily bent slightly to return it to its place, fingers brushing the cool metal and lingering just long enough to ensure it was aligned exactly with the edge of the crate. The sunlight shifted, casting long shadows across the boards, and the heat of the day settled into the folds of her dress, warming her shoulders as she straightened, brushing her hands against her skirt to remove dust, and adjusted the bundle of herbs and letters she carried, aligning the edges with deliberate care. Ethan's gaze remained fixed, noting the subtle strength in her posture, the quiet authority in her movements, the way she engaged with each object and each small task with a patience and attention that spoke of skill unnoticed by the casual observer. A breeze lifted loose strands of her hair, and she tucked them back behind her ears, smoothing the shawl across her shoulders, a small gesture of care that held a weight beyond its simplicity. The town continued around them, the sound of merchants calling, carts creaking, and distant voices blending with the shuffle of feet, but Lily moved through it with a focus that separated her from the ordinary flow, each step, each motion a testament to quiet resilience and presence. She paused by a crate stacked with fresh produce, adjusting a small bundle that had shifted during the morning, her fingers tracing the edges and smoothing them into place, while her eyes noted the position of every cart and person nearby. Ethan shifted slightly, a subtle acknowledgment passing in the quiet of the afternoon, the recognition of deliberate care and understated competence in a world that often overlooked such things. The light caught the folds of her dress, the strap of her satchel, the gentle curve of her hands as they moved with precise purpose, and in that moment, a small, unspoken understanding passed between them, a silent acknowledgment of skill, awareness, and quiet strength, a connection woven in gestures, shadows, and the warm, dusty glow of the sunlit square. The sun began its slow descent, casting long golden shadows across the wooden boards of the town square, and Lily Harper moved with careful deliberation, her eyes sweeping the area with quiet attentiveness as she adjusted the bundle of letters in her satchel. The faint scent of pine sap and warm bread mingled with the heat rising from the sun-baked earth, filling the air with a tangible warmth that pressed gently against her skin through the fabric of her dress. She stepped toward a small pile of crates, brushing the edges with careful hands, aligning them precisely and smoothing the surfaces of the goods stacked atop them, each motion deliberate and measured. Ethan Caldwell remained near the post of the general store, hat brim low, observing her with a keen, patient gaze, noticing the subtle control in her posture, the careful handling of her belongings, and the quiet authority she carried without ever demanding attention. A breeze lifted loose strands of her hair across her forehead, and she tucked them back behind her ears, adjusting the folds of her shawl against her shoulders. She bent slightly to pick up a fallen piece of straw from the boardwalk, setting it neatly alongside the others, and allowed her gaze to move across the square, noting the placement of carts, the positions of people moving about, and the faint shimmer of sunlight on metal handles. The chatter of the market created a soft, constant hum, blending with the distant clop of hooves and the scrape of wagon wheels on the boards, yet Lily's movements were deliberate, a quiet rhythm that harmonized with the surrounding sounds rather than being swept away by them. She straightened, brushing her hands along her dress and adjusting her satchel once more, the leather worn smooth from use, and allowed a subtle glance toward Ethan, noting the slight lift of his brow as he acknowledged her presence without a word. A child ran past, scattering small pieces of straw and leaving a tin cup tipped over, and Lily moved with quiet efficiency to set it right, her fingers grazing the metal as she restored order to the small disruption. The warmth of the afternoon sun highlighted the careful motions of her hands, the alignment of the letters and parcels, the gentle sweep of her dress across the boards, and the precise way she balanced each step in the sunlit dust. Ethan's gaze lingered, noting the competence in her movements, the unspoken control she exerted over her surroundings, and the understated strength in her posture and gestures. Lily paused briefly at the edge of the fountain, observing the water as it rippled and caught the sunlight, and adjusted the letters once more, smoothing the folds and aligning them carefully. The town continued its rhythm around her, the merchants calling softly to each other, the carts shifting, and the occasional clop of hooves blending into a gentle soundscape. Yet she moved with focus, deliberate attention, and quiet assurance, each gesture reinforcing the subtle presence and competence she carried, recognized by the one who had been watching all along. The unspoken connection between them building in the warmth and light of the sunlit, dusty square. The afternoon shadows stretched longer across the wooden boards of the town square as Lily Harper moved with careful attention, her fingers brushing the edges of a small pile of letters she had set upon a crate, straightening them with deliberate care and smoothing each fold until they were perfectly aligned. The sun warmed the dust beneath her boots, and the faint scent of pine sap, fresh bread, and the earthy aroma of the town mixed with the soft hum of distant conversation, creating a quiet rhythm that seemed to pulse with the slow movements of the square. She stepped around a cart carrying sacks of grain, pausing to adjust a bundle of herbs she carried in her satchel, brushing the edges of the basket as if ensuring the balance of the entire arrangement, her motions precise and thoughtful. Ethan Caldwell remained near the post of the general store, his hat brim low and his eyes tracking her movements, noting the subtle control in her posture, the quiet confidence in the way she navigated through the crowd, and the deliberate attention she paid to every object she touched. A breeze stirred, lifting the strands of her hair across her forehead, and she tucked them back behind her ears, adjusting the folds of her shawl against her shoulders, the motion small but exact, a signal of her awareness of every detail. She knelt briefly to lift a fallen piece of straw, setting it neatly alongside others, and allowed her gaze to sweep across the square, observing the positions of carts, people, and animals, her presence both unobtrusive and quietly commanding. The sunlight shifted, creating patterns across the boards and illuminating the folds of her dress, the strap of her satchel, and the subtle movements of her hands as she rearranged a small tin cup that had tipped during the morning activity. Ethan's gaze followed every motion, noting the gentle authority in her actions, the competence in her deliberate attention to detail, and the quiet strength that contrasted with the casual, hurried movements of the townspeople. Lily straightened, brushing dust from her dress, and adjusted her satchel once more, the leather worn smooth from use, her eyes scanning the square with the practiced attention of someone who had learned to observe carefully and act with precision. A child ran past, scattering a small pile of straw, and she moved to gather it efficiently, smoothing the pieces into place, her hands steady, careful, and deliberate. The warm light of the late afternoon sun highlighted the subtle strength in her posture and the meticulous movements of her fingers, each small act reinforcing the quiet resilience and measured control she carried. Ethan shifted slightly, a faint nod acknowledging her presence, the recognition of skill, patience, and understated strength passing between them without a single word, an unspoken understanding settling in the golden light of the sunlit, dusty square, each aware of the other through observation, subtle gestures, and the silent rhythm of the town around them. The afternoon light softened as Lily Harper approached the small wooden table set near the center of the square, the boards beneath her boots warm from the sun, yet cool in the shade of the surrounding buildings. She set her satchel gently on the table, brushing her hands across its worn leather and adjusting the bundle of letters and herbs she had carried with careful precision. The town around her moved in a quiet rhythm, merchants calling softly to one another, the shuffle of feet on boards and dirt blending with the distant clip-clop of horses and the occasional creak of wagon wheels. Ethan Caldwell stepped closer from the edge of the square, hat brim still low over his eyes, observing the careful way she handled each item, noting the deliberate motions that conveyed competence and thoughtfulness without a word or flourish. Lily's fingers smoothed the edges of the letters again, aligning each one with gentle care, and she glanced up briefly, catching the movement of Ethan shifting his stance, the faint acknowledgment in the tilt of his head. She arranged the herbs in a neat pile beside the letters, each bundle placed just so, and as she straightened, a small breeze lifted loose strands of her hair, which she tucked behind her ears, adjusting the folds of her shawl over her shoulders. A child ran past, carrying a small basket, and she bent slightly to set it upright when it tipped, her movements precise, her attention never wavering, the smallest acts of care drawing her ever so slightly into the awareness of those who observed her without disruption. Ethan moved a few steps closer, his boots scuffing lightly against the boards, the soft sound mingling with the low hum of conversation and the faint jingle of metal from the carts, his eyes tracing each careful motion she made, from the alignment of the letters to the gentle adjustment of the parcels in her satchel, recognizing the subtle authority she carried through quiet observation and attention to detail. The sun dropped lower, casting long golden shadows across the boards and highlighting the curves of her hands, the folds of her dress, the small movements of her body as she worked, each gesture deliberate and measured, revealing a resilience and calm confidence that contrasted with the hurried motions of the townspeople around her. Lily paused briefly, glancing at the fountain nearby, water glinting in the late afternoon light, and adjusted the letters once more, ensuring each fold was straight, each edge aligned, the movement smooth and practiced. Ethan's gaze remained fixed, noting the unspoken strength in her posture, the patience and precision in every small action, and the way she occupied space with quiet authority. A gentle wind stirred the dust at the edges of the boards, lifting it in soft swirls that caught the sunlight, and Lily breathed in the sense of pine sap, warm bread, and sun-baked earth, centering herself in the rhythm of the square, aware of every detail, every sound, every movement around her. She straightened fully, adjusting her satchel one last time, smoothing the folds of her dress, and allowed a small, steady glance toward Ethan, their silent acknowledgment passing in the space between them, a quiet recognition of skill, care, and measured presence. The warm glow of the sun highlighting the subtle connection forming in the sunlit, dusty square. The golden light of late afternoon lingered across the town square, casting long, warm shadows that stretched over the wooden boards and danced across the dust, swirling gently in the air. Lily Harper stepped closer to the small table near the fountain, setting her satchel carefully on the edge, fingers brushing the worn leather as she adjusted the bundle of letters and herbs she had carried with meticulous attention. She arranged them with precision, smoothing each fold and aligning each item so that everything appeared calm and orderly, a small reflection of her quiet command over her surroundings. The air carried the mingled scents of pine sap, warm bread, and the faint tang of livestock, blending with the soft hum of merchants calling to one another and the occasional clop of horse hooves on distant boards. Ethan Caldwell approached slowly from the shade of the general store, his boots scuffing lightly against the boards, the brim of his hat shadowing the sharp lines of his face as he observed Lily with attentive, patient eyes. He noted the deliberate care in each of her movements, the way she adjusted the folds of her shawl against her shoulders, the precise placement of each letter and herb, and the gentle, measured way she straightened her dress as she worked. A breeze stirred, lifting strands of her hair across her forehead, and she tucked them back neatly, smoothing the folds of her clothing as she took in the scene around her. Lily paused briefly to adjust a small tin cup that had been nudged during the morning activity, setting it upright with careful fingers, and allowed her gaze to sweep across the square, noting the positions of carts, animals, and townspeople, moving with unobtrusive grace, yet commanding quiet attention through subtle precision. The sunlight shifted, casting long, delicate shadows across the boards and highlighting the curve of her hands, the folds of her dress, and the careful alignment of the items she tended. Ethan's eyes followed every motion, recognizing the understated strength in her posture, the quiet authority in her movements, and the way she engaged with her environment with focused intent, a competence invisible to anyone not paying close attention. She bent slightly to gather a fallen leaf, smoothing it into a neat pile alongside others, each small gesture demonstrating thoughtfulness and deliberate care. The warmth of the sun on her shoulders, the gentle swirls of dust in the air, the rhythmic hum of the town, and the soft glint of light on the boards all created a setting in which every precise movement she made stood out, a quiet testament to her patience and awareness. Ethan shifted his stance slightly, acknowledging her subtle control of the space and the calm efficiency. In her actions, the silent understanding between them deepening in the golden glow of the late afternoon. Lily straightened fully, adjusting her satchel and smoothing her dress once more, and allowed a slow exhale, the quiet acknowledgement of skill, careful attention, and unspoken connection passing silently between them in the warm, sunlit square, each aware of the other through the rhythm of their movements, the attention to detail, and the gentle, shared observation of the bustling town around them. The sun dipped lower toward the horizon, casting a warm orange glow across the dusty boards of the town square, and Lily Harper adjusted the strap of her satchel one final time before setting it carefully on the edge of the small wooden table. She smoothed the folds of her dress, brushing away the remaining dust, and arranged the letters and herbs with deliberate precision, each bundle aligned, as if to mark the end of a long day of measured attention. The market had begun to quiet, the merchants calling softly to one another as they packed up their wares, the clop of distant horse hooves blending with the shuffle of feet and the occasional scrape of wagon wheels. Ethan Caldwell stepped forward from the shade of the general store, his hat brim low over his eyes, and for the first time he allowed his gaze to linger fully on Lily, noticing not just the deliberate care in her movements, but the quiet strength in her posture, the subtle authority she carried without demand or flourish. She straightened fully, taking a deep breath, and allowed herself a small, steady glance toward him, and in that moment their unspoken understanding deepened, a recognition of skill, awareness, and quiet competence that had built gradually through the day. A soft breeze stirred, lifting strands of her hair and the edges of her shawl, and she tucked them back neatly, her fingers lingering on the fabric as if acknowledging the presence of the wind and the warmth of the sun. Lily stepped around a crate that had been left askew, setting it upright with careful hands, and straightened, letting her eyes sweep the square one last time, noting the alignment of carts, the positioning of animals, and the movement of townspeople who were slowly leaving, the dust rising in soft spirals around their boots. Ethan moved slightly closer, the sound of his boots subtle against the boards, and offered a faint nod of acknowledgment, recognizing the quiet, steadfast presence she had maintained, the deliberate precision in every small act she had carried out. Lily bent briefly to gather a small fallen leaf, setting it alongside others she had organized earlier, and as she straightened, the sunlight caught the subtle curve of her hands, the folds of her dress, the edges of the letters she had so carefully aligned, and the golden glow highlighted the calm assurance she carried. The town continued its gentle rhythm, the soft hum of conversation, the distant sound of hooves, the occasional clatter of a cart, but in the warm late afternoon light, Lily stood with quiet authority, each motion measured and deliberate, and Ethan's gaze followed her, noting the understated strength, patience, and competence she exuded. She lifted her head, allowing her gray eyes to meet his once more, and in that shared glance the day's silent acknowledgments, careful observations, and subtle interactions culminated in a final, unspoken understanding. The warmth of the sun, the dust floating in the air, the gentle patterns of light across the boards, and the quiet presence of the town around them created a space in which Lily's quiet strength and attentive care were fully visible, recognized by the one who had observed every detail, and a sense of belonging, trust, and subtle connection settled between them, marking the close of the day in the sunlit, dusty square.